All right. Well, we're wrapping up our study not of the whole theme for the semester, but we're wrapping up our study of metaethics. So morality is the theme for the semester, but we thought, at least for the first few weeks, we should dive down into metaethics first before we jump into normative ethics. Those of you that might be new to this, what is metaethics? Most people are used to normative ethics, just regular ethics, if you will. And that's talking about whether a certain thing is right or wrong, whether a certain thing is good or bad, like maybe the death penalty or abortion. But metaethics asks a little bit deeper questions. So metaethics is about things like, well, is there even such a thing as objective moral truth? Or what we've been focusing on is what makes something morally good or bad. So it's different than is something good or bad. The broader question or the deeper question of metaethics is what makes something good or bad. As I've noted, pretty much all theists agree that God is the source and foundation of morality, but they've disagreed on exactly how God plays that role. How is God the foundation of morality? And so we've seen several different options. The two main ones throughout history has been natural law theory and divine command theory. And we spent a whole night just walking through those two theories. Now, one thing that we noted was that every metaethical theory, whether it's a theistic theory or an atheistic theory, tries to explain two things. And this is important to keep this distinction in mind. And the distinction is the difference between moral value and moral obligation. So moral value is usually couched in the terms of good and bad. And obligation has more to do with our duties, what makes something right or wrong. A lot of times these two things go hand in hand, but you can imagine situations where somebody does a good thing, maybe they build an orphanage, but they didn't have to do that. It wasn't their duty or they weren't obligated to do that, but we still want to say that's a good thing. So these are two separate issues in metaethics, and so every theory tries to explain where these two things come from, how these things can exist objectively. Last week, we spent the whole evening on my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle theory, my TMNT, and I got a lot of good suggestions for a word that begins with N, so I'll be thinking of which one to use. But just like the other theories, what I tried to do with my theory, best I could, was explain these two things. So according to my theory, something is morally good if it resembles not merely God, but in particularly resembles the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. So we want to be more precise than just something is good if it resembles God, but because some things resembling God wouldn't be good. In fact, if you think of Adam and Eve in the garden, they tried to resemble God in a certain way, and God specifically said that what they were doing wasn't good, their attempt to be like God. So we want to be more specific and say, well, what is it about resembling God that makes something good or bad? And I'm claiming that it's the love between the members of the Trinity is the ultimate exemplar, if you will. That if we are like that, then, or an action is like that, resembles that, then it's good. For my theory of moral obligation, it's a fairly standard divine command theory, possibly, although I put in this Trinitarian aspect as a twist. And so we talk through kind of how I bring in truths about God's Trinity, about God being a Trinity, to help flesh out my theory of moral obligation. Tonight what we're going to do is a comparison between my theory and Wielenberg's theory. So compare, contrast. I'm going to make the case that my theory is a better explanation for objective morality. To get you ready for Sunday night, this is what we're going to be doing, him and I, live at UNL in person. I'm looking forward to this. He's going to be here for the weekend. I'll pick him up from the airport. We'll eat a couple meals together. I want to introduce him to Nebraska Runzas, maybe one, possibly two. So looking forward to have him here Him and I have been having this conversation for years. Even this last week, as I was getting ready, I emailed him some stuff, and he emailed me back, and it helps me think through both his theory and mine. So I'd consider him a friend, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation up on stage and introducing other people to this conversation. As I've mentioned before, he refers to his theory as Godless Normative Realism. And one of the reasons why I have wanted to engage with him is he's kind of come to be the main critic of Christian metaethics, according to William Lane Craig, and I would agree with that. His theory, as we've discussed, we spent a whole evening on his theory a few weeks ago, is that moral truth can exist objectively without a foundation, without God. And so that's what, I challenge him on, and he challenges me on my theory. We agree, this is one of the things that we'll have to explain on Sunday to probably the majority of the audience, might not understand, that him and I agree that there is objective moral truth. It's just that we disagree on what's the best explanation for how truth can be objectively real. There's a sense then which what I'm really doing is defending the second premise of the moral argument for God. It kind of blows my mind that I've spent the last 7 years working on one premise in one argument for the existence of God. That's how rich this topic is, this conversation is about God and whether he exists or not. So there's a sense in which my theory and my criticism of his theory is simply just a defense of the second premise in the moral argument for God. Well, here's how I'm going to lay tonight out. Okay, we're going to look at 5 things, 5 elements, if you will, that I'm going to argue are required in a theory in order for objective morality to exist. So 5 elements that are required for there to be objective moral truth. And then I'm going to argue for all 5 of them that my theory has that element and his does not. Therefore, my theory is a better explanation for objective morality than his. So the pattern for every single one, all 5 of them, this is the pattern that I'll follow. First, I'll argue that element X, all 5 of these, are important, possibly even necessary for morality to exist objectively. And then I have it, Wielenberg doesn't, therefore my theory is a better explanation. Now I am going to pause after each element to give you guys a chance to discuss it. So we'll actually pause and let you guys discuss 5 times tonight. Usually we don't do that many. So it might turn into a little bit of a longer evening, but I can tell from your faces that you guys are up for it. If not, there's coffee brewing in the kitchen. All right, number 1, an ultimate moral standard. It's important, possibly even necessary, for there to be an ultimate moral standard from which we can judge whether other things are good or bad. Linda Zagzebski, a philosophy professor at the University of Oklahoma, makes this case. For example, she says here, the function of an ultimate moral standard is to fix the reference of the term good person, without the use of any concepts, whether descriptive or non-descriptive. An exemplar, ultimate moral standard, therefore allows the series of conceptual definitions to get started. The circle of conceptual definitions of the most important concepts in a moral theory, virtue, right act, duty, good outcome, and so on, is broken then by an indexical reference to a paradigmatically good person. A couple other quotes from Linda. Ultimate moral standard serves as a standard of perfection against which the rest of us are measured, and thus what is good for us in that sense is to imitate the exemplar. So she has a very similar theory of moral value than I and Robert Adams do. But in this particular context, she's discussing how important it is to have this ultimate moral standard. She goes on to argue that this ultimate moral standard has to be perfect. She said that perfection has the capacity to ground moral value in a way that nothing short of perfection can. Kind of like the sun in Plato's allegory of the good in his Republic book. Perfect goodness is essentially diffusive, the source of all lesser goods. Last quote from Zagzebski. She argued that God is the best candidate for the ultimate moral standard. God's is good in the same way that the standard meter stick is 1 meter long. So then God is the standard of goodness. If you know, they don't do this anymore, but originally they had a meter stick, I think in Paris, if I remember right, and that was the ultimate standard of what a meter is. And that is what she is using as an example for how God functions as that moral exemplar. Of course, my theory has an ultimate moral standard. It is the same as hers. It is God. But I extend that idea by noting the loving personal relationships in the Trinity. That those loving relationships are the key aspect of God which serves as the ultimate moral standard. These relationships then between God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are what other things can be morally measured by. So in other words, something is morally good if it resembles those loving relationships in the Trinity. Now, Wielenberg has no such ultimate moral standard. And without a concrete, fixed, absolute moral standard within his theory, there's nothing by which he has to measure whether other things are good or bad. Now, he might refer to his brute ethical facts at this point, but I don't see how these abstract facts, even if they would exist, could serve as an ultimate moral standard. At a minimum, I could say that a concrete being as God, existing as three persons in loving relationship, provides a more fitting or a more plausible ultimate moral standard for morality than so-called brute ethical facts. So here's how the argument flowed, right? An ultimate moral standard is an important, possibly even necessary requirement for there to be objective morality. My theory has this, Wielenberg's doesn't, therefore mine's a better explanation for objective morality. It's similar, remember that silly example I used of somebody knocking at the door and we're positing theories of who or what could be behind the door? It's similar to what we're doing here, and this is the same sort of thing that goes on in all fields, history, science. It's abductive reasoning where we're trying to ascertain what's the most reasonable explanation, what's the most plausible explanation based on the reasons and evidence that we have at our disposal. So I'll let you guys get together now. We've gone through the first one. We got 4 more to go. But get in a couple of groups. You guys maybe back there could break up into 2. You guys could join a group here, and just discuss the strengths and weaknesses of this first argument. You could discuss the first one, the second premise, third, whatever you think might be the strength or the weakness here. So I'll give you guys a few minutes. All right, let's move on to number 2. As I always say, these are just supposed to be the beginning of conversations, and hopefully you guys can continue them later, afterwards. I think we had people here till 11 o'clock last week, which is great. Or tomorrow, over coffee, whenever it works for you to continue these conversations. All right, let's move on to number 2. And this is an objective purpose for humans. Now, you might remember this guy. We talked about Alistair McIntyre way at the beginning of this study. And he, I think, and a lot of people agree, did a tremendous job explaining the importance of there being an objective purpose for humans in order for objective morality to exist. Now, he often refers to it as a telos, which is just a Greek word for like purpose or design. So you'll hear the term teleology in this conversation. But for example, a quote from McIntyre, He argued ever since belief in teleology, objective purpose for humans, was discredited, moral philosophers have attempted to provide some alternative rational secular account of the nature and status of morality. But all these attempts, and he goes through them historically in his famous book, After Virtue, all these attempts, various and variously impressive as they have in fact failed, a failure perceived most clearly by Nietzsche. So Nietzsche can be a very useful ally in this conversation to Christians. So After Virtue, probably one of the biggest works of moral philosophy in the 20th century, he gives a historical account of how after the classical tradition, which includes this, purpose, was discarded, there were several other systems proposed to provide a new basis of morality, such that morality would apply objectively to everyone. But, according to MacIntyre, he argues that none of them worked, and they all just ended up in this subjective morality, where morality simply becomes based on individual will or desire or emotion. Now, MacIntyre is not the only one who argues for that. Here's an atheist who makes the same argument. Thomas Nagel is a well-known atheist philosopher and a moral realist, so he believes in objective morality. But he also affirmed the vital, if not necessary, role that teleology has to play in a theory of objective morality. He argues in his book that if there is no objective telos or objective purpose for humanity, then there can be no objective morality. So both MacIntyre and Nagel, I think, can be used to make the case for the importance of an objective purpose for humanity in order for there to be objective morality. Of course, my theory has such a purpose. I claim it is God's intention for why He created human beings in the first place, and that is, as we've discussed, that humans would join the communion of loving relationships in the Trinity. Bottom line, He created us to love Him, to love God, and to love others, the greatest commandments. That is our very purpose and meaning to life. Here is another one who has chronicled how throughout history all sorts of figures say that humans were made for some kind of a union with God. Maybe they use different language that I'm using, but it's the same bottom line. Philosophers, Christian, non-Christians, and of course Christian theologians have argued, many of them, that this is the fundamental basis for the moral life, that God, the purpose God created us for was to be friends or lovers of God and of others, some kind of a union with God. I would make the case that Wielenberg just does not have this element in his theory. I think it's difficult then for him to maintain objective morality when there is no objective purpose for humanity. I think because he doesn't have that in his theory, he can't overcome the dreaded fact-value dichotomy, or the fact-value dilemma. We've talked about that before in this study. But that simply says, goes back to Hume, if not before that, David Hume, that how can you establish a should from what is? It seems like there has to be some sort of intentionality behind how things are to establish a should or a moral duty. There has to be intentionality there. Otherwise, you just have facts about how things are. My theory, of course, has intentionality at the root of reality. This intentionality that provides the should, which Wielenberg's theory doesn't have intentionality. It's unclear how morality could be objective if there's no divine intentionality behind the universe, giving it that shouldness. I'll give you a long quote here from a Christian philosopher. I've tried to pronounce his last name, but I always get it wrong, so I'm not even going to try. But I'll just read his quote. This is in a context of a paper he wrote where he was criticizing Wielenberg's theory. And he wrote, "In a godless world, there's no underlying," there's that word again, telos, such as the divine will, according to which some natural properties conform to the way the world is supposed to be, while others do not. In this world, an action that has no, intentionality behind it, an action which exhibits the natural property kindness is no more supposed to happen than one which exhibits the natural property of cruelty. In that context, it's arbitrary to assert that an act's being kind makes it right, or an act's being cruel makes it wrong. One needs some sort of teleological principle, some telos, that tells us how the world is supposed to go. Now, I do want to affirm that at the beginning of his major book, Wielenberg's major book, Robust Ethics, he addresses this issue. And he explains that, at least according to his theory, life can have purpose and meaning, even if there is no teleology behind the universe. He has a quote here, which I'll read. He said, here's just one example of how somebody can have meaning and purpose, even if there's no ultimate purpose in the universe. He wrote that by engaging in intrinsically valuable activities, a person can make her life meaningful in one very important sense. She can make her life good for her. My problem with this, though, is this is very subjective. Just the phrase, make her life good for her. This is a subjective thing, not objective. And if something's subjective, then it is relative. Yeah, maybe it's good for her, but it's not good for somebody else. Or if somebody wants to make the case that rape is meaningful for them, then somebody else could say, well, it's not meaningful for me. So the problem with trying to build a theory of objective morality on the foundation of subjective beliefs seems very problematic to me. It seems like we're building it, trying to build it on the foundation of subjectivism and relativism. How could you build a foundation, or how could you build objective morality on such a subjective and relative foundation? So, here's the argument in a nutshell. Again, similar pattern you're used to by now. I'm making the case that for there to be objective moral truth, there needs to be some objective, not merely subjective, but objective purpose for humans. My theory has that, again, the Trinity, God creating us to be in communion with Him in the Trinity, to join that fellowship. Wielenberg doesn't have such an objective purpose. So, the conclusion that I would draw is that my theory is a better explanation for objective morality than Wielenberg's. So again, I'll give you a few minutes. You guys can discuss this, see what you think the strengths, weaknesses are of this argument. All right, go ahead. All right, we're going to move on to number 3 now. I really appreciate this opportunity to teach this material over the last 5 weeks. This is, if you're new to Ratio Christi, this is a fairly deep dive, and we normally don't dive this deep into Ratio Christi, maybe every 10 or 20 years. We just don't dive down this deep into things that often. But we have a special opportunity since, I've researched this very specific topic for the last 6 or 7 years to go through it in a deep sense, and I appreciate the opportunity, given this platform, if you will, to be able to teach through these things that I've studied so deeply. I'm hoping to, get my work published, and I'm looking for a publisher to do that. And hopefully this fall, I'm going to pick that up again and find somebody. So let's jump into number 3, and this is a social context for moral obligation. Just like the second one, the one we just got done talking about, had more to do with the shouldness. That was more about moral obligation. This third one is also going to be more about objective moral obligation as well. And this is the importance of having a social context in reality. So this is something that goes back to Robert Adams' theory again. And a very large part of his theory is that moral obligations arise in the context of personal social relationships. So I'll let him explain. Take a look. The most important difference between the right, remember these two different aspects, the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. The most important difference between the right, obligations, and the good is that right and wrong, matters of obligation, must be understood in the relation of a social context. In other words, if I have an obligation, I believe it only can be in a personal relationship or in a social system of relationships. If an action's wrong, likewise, there must be a person or persons distinct from the agent who may appropriately have an adverse reaction to it. Another way to think about it is like this. Morality is inherently personal, right? I mean, chairs, impersonal objects, this carpet, the light bulbs, they don't really have any moral dimension to them, right? I mean, I could use them to commit an immoral act, or maybe a moral act if I was rescuing somebody who was drowning with a chair or something. So you can use impersonal things and moral acts, but they really don't function themselves in a moral dimension. We don't have moral obligations to impersonal things like impersonal objects, and I would argue even impersonal things such as principles or circumstances or properties. Even if they're moral principles, I don't think we have obligations to principles. No, I would agree with Adams, our obligations are to other persons, not to principles themselves. Of course, Adams, in his Finite and Infinite Goods, his book, he extends this social theory of obligation to our relationship with God and claims that this, our social relationship with God, is ultimately where our obligations come from. He argued only by bringing God into the picture that a social theory then of the nature of moral obligation can avoid the charge that it is too subjectivist. So he's got a much longer argument for this, of course. I'm just summarizing these because we've got so many to go through. But he makes the case that you've got to bring God into the picture or you're going to be left, again, with just subjective morality. Zebski, down at the University of Oklahoma, agrees. She's talking about Adams' theory in this context. She says, the notion of obligation in the social context that holds between God and us is indirectly defended by its similarity to obligation that arises out of our human relationships. If something like obligation arises in loving relationships between persons who make demands on each other, if not met, harm that relationship and make blame and guilt appropriate, then it's only a small step to the view that all obligation arises in a similar fashion. But in order to do so, there has to be someone who we are, humanity that is, related to in a social relationship. Evans, a moral philosopher down at Baylor University in Texas, we've talked about Evans before, he concluded that moral obligations are universal because all humans are God's creatures and thus all of them participate in this social relationship that grounds moral obligations. Now, I agree with these three moral philosophers, and I think my theory goes a step further than just saying, it's God who we're in a social relationship. Because if I bring truths about God's being a Trinity into the conversation, I think it extends our explanation further by explaining why and how there's a social context for moral obligation. So if God does exist as a Trinity, if He exists as three divine persons in these loving social relationships, then there's a sense in which ultimate reality itself is social. There's a sense in which all reality takes place in a social context if God really does exist as a Trinity. Christian theologian Millard Erickson said it this way. He argued that if the Creator consists of three persons in loving relationships with each other, then the fundamental characteristic of the universe is personal, and reality itself is primarily social. That's why I'm convinced that God as Trinity is a fitting explanation for why there is this social dynamic to reality, and a social dynamic that's so critical for there to be objective morality. So in other words, when God created human persons, right, before creation there were just three divine persons, but then when God created human persons, it was merely an extension of that ultimate social context in the Trinity. Obligations then, I argue, my theory says, obligations arise in our social relationship with God, which is merely an image of and flows out of the social relationships in God. So we were created in His image to be accountable to Him via this social relationship with Him. Christian philosopher William Hasker says it this way. He wrote, "For those who find personal relationships to be central to what transpires between God and God's human creatures, a doctrine of the Trinity provides a powerful reinforcement by finding such social relationships in the very being of God." So if we're going to say that social context, social relationships are critical for objective moral obligation, God existing as a Trinity provides a fitting explanation for why and how that's the case. Wielenberg doesn't have such an element in his theory. Now, he could, and I'm sure he does, affirm that obligations arise from our human social relationships, but he lacks a good explanation of how and why this is the case. Especially, I would say, since he affirms that these social relationships came about accidentally through a haphazard evolutionary process. So if social relationships are just really an accident that nature selected for because they led to greater chances of survival and reproduction, it seems hard to say how that is a foundation of objective morality, which he claims has existed from all eternity past as these abstract objects. Social relationships seem like something very new on the horizon, if his theory is true. Not only new on the horizon, but very contingent and came about accidentally through evolution. Whereas my theory has social relationships at the very core of reality. In fact, the whole universe all of our reality came from a social context, which provides, I say, a better fit for objective morality. All right, so here's the argument. You should be familiar with this pattern by now. So I'll let you guys discuss what do you think about this third argument. So I'll give you a few minutes. Go ahead to discuss. All right, let's move on to number 4. We're more than halfway done. Now this fourth one is related to number 3. And the fourth one is simply that there is required for objective morality, it is for there to be objective morality, it seems as though we need some personal authority at the head of the chain of moral obligation. So this one assumes, number 3, this one assumes that there needs to be a social context for objective moral obligation. And this one just goes on top of that and says, okay, if obligations arise out of social relationships, then there has to be someone that humanity is in a social relationship with to ultimately generate these obligations. I think a case can be made that this someone needs to be personal because, as I've said tonight, or made the case, we're only obligated to persons. We're not obligated to facts. even the golden rule or any other moral fact you want to posit, we're not obligated to facts, we're obligated to persons. I think the case can be made that this someone must be a person that we're accountable to, such that as our ultimate moral authority, he functions as the, if you will, kind of the top of the hierarchy of moral obligations. There's got to be a head at the top of that chain, so to speak. So take a look. This is an argument put together by Vern Poythress. He wrote that moral absolutes imply personal responsibility. Persons are ultimately responsible only to persons. The rule to make a claim on us must come from an authority. An authority is always personal. If we doubt this, if we think otherwise, if we doubt the personal character of authority, we can also observe that a rule must be specific. And this requires language, meaning, articulation, all things which only belong to persons. So for there even to be moral obligations, moral truth, it seems like there needs to be an ultimate person, because moral authority is personal. To have moral absolutes, the moral authority must be absolute in order for it to be not relative or unchanging. So we must have a personal absolute at the head of the chain of moral obligation. Now, interestingly enough, Immanuel Kant, the well-known philosopher from the 1800s, can be used here to make this case. Now, I say that's interesting because a lot of people present Kant as an enemy to bringing religion into the moral conversation at all. But I think that's a misreading of Kant, and the scholarship is starting to change on that. So one example, and I just want to kind of make this case here for a moment. John Hare at Yale University makes the case that Kant has been misread on this issue, and that in fact Kant continued to believe and urged us to believe that a personal God exists and that we should recognize our duties as God's commands. So Hare, and he's not the only one, I'm just using him as an example, makes the case that Kant wasn't against bringing religion into this conversation of morality. What Kant was against was a very specific type of divine command theory. Okay? But in general, Kant was a divine command theorist. Another quote, this is from Hare, describing Kant. He said, Kant distinguishes between the head of the moral kingdom to which we belong and the rest of the membership of this kingdom, and says that the head of the kingdom must be similar to what Poythress said, completely independent being, without needs, and with an unlimited power adequate to his will. There's no doubt Kant's talking about God here as the head of, or king of this kingdom, and without such a king, there wouldn't be a moral kingdom at all. So in other words, according to Hare at least, Kant made the argument that there has to be a head at the kingdom of morality, an authority, if you will, that we are accountable to in order for there to be objective moral obligation. And Kant proposed God as this ultimate moral authority. So let's look straight from the horse's mouth. This is a quote from Kant himself. Kant wrote that the moral law leads through the concept of the highest good to religion. So he does appeal to religion ultimately in his moral theory. That is, to the recognition of all duties as divine commands. This is Kant saying this. Which must nevertheless be regarded as commands of a supreme being, because only from a will that is morally perfect, holy and beneficent, can at the same time all-powerful, and so through harmony with this will, can we hope to attain the highest good, which the moral law makes it our duty to take as the object of our endeavors. So bottom line, Kant and Hare making the case that there has to be a head or a king of this moral kingdom. The way that I chose to phrase it is that there has to be a personal authority at the head of the chain of moral obligation. Of course, I have this in my theory, right? God as Trinity. This isn't unique to my theory, of course. Any divine command theory would have this, whether it's Robert Adams or Immanuel Kant's divine command theory. In fact, Adams explained in his divine command theory that obligations that have full moral validity are aptly understood as constituted by divine commands, and thus by requirements arising in a social system in which God is the leading participant. I think it's pretty clear that my theory has this element. Wielenberg's does not. So according to Wielenberg, he would argue that our social relationships with other humans and the circumstances surrounding them are sufficient themselves to generate moral obligations. So he uses this example, maybe you've read it already, he uses this example of coming across a child who is on fire. Right, this is a fairly common example in moral philosophy. But let's say you come across a child who's in flames and there's a bucket of water sitting there. So according to Wielenberg, the child's suffering, the presence of a bucket of water, and so on, the circumstances, give rise to your moral obligation to douse the flames. My theory is that various features of the situation, facts about the situation, cause you to be morally obligated to help. And I'm making the case that that just isn't sufficient. Facts, features, characteristics aren't sufficient to generate moral obligations. Okay? How could impersonal things generate obligations? Now, I would say, I agree with him, we do have obligations here. That's where him and I agree. We have an obligation to put out the flames. He agrees to that, I agree to that. My argument is that if there was no God, no ultimate moral authority that we're accountable to, it's unclear why we would be obligated to do that. Now, I could affirm and I could understand somebody saying, well, look, evolution selected within us this subjective desire to douse the flames. Nature selected creatures, humans, who, whatever you want to say, that have those sort of subjective internal desires. Because, you know, a group or a species that had that internal desire to douse the flames would have better chances at survival and reproduction than a corresponding species that wouldn't have that internal desire. So I can understand in an evolutionary explanation of things where a subjective desire like that would come from, but that doesn't make it objectively true. I think it more clearly is the case that we have an objective obligation here. If there is a God that exists that we're accountable to. And without that, it's unclear to me why we would be objectively obligated to do anything here. Now this is I think what causes confusion sometimes. I don't deny the importance of the circumstances or our relationship with the child. Okay? I think part of those things are part of what generates the moral obligation. It's just that they can't by themselves. They're merely links in the chain, whereas God is like the head of the chain, pulling the chain. So I've used this example a lot. Think of a truck pulling a trailer with a chain, okay? And the chain links might be all those circumstances. Our relationships with the child, our other human relationships, the facts and the circumstances surrounding the situation, the fact that there's a bucket there, the fact that the child is suffering, all those are links in the chain which are important. But if there wasn't a truck providing the pulling to the chain, the trailer wouldn't go anywhere. And in my theory, that's what I'm positing as God. is that he is the truck, and then he is pulling the chain, the circumstances, and causing that external pull that we feel when we're morally obligated to do something. So the links in the chain are important, but by themselves they can't really do anything. So here's a quote from John Hare again, Yale University. He says, I think he's saying the same thing here. Our human-to-human relationships do sometimes make things morally obligatory. But we should see divine command theory as operating in answer to why we should hold ourselves under those obligations. For example, he says, look, if I promise to take my children out for lunch, then I have an obligation to keep that promise. Take them out for lunch. But there's still the question why I should keep my promises. To draw the implication from my having said I promise to my obligation, I need to endorse the institution of promising, promise keeping. And the fact that God requires this faithfulness of me gives me a reason for this endorsement. Again, the circumstances are important, facts, human relationships, but by themselves, I don't see how they could objectively create objective moral obligations. So, I would argue that Wielenberg's theory is lacking here. I just don't think it's plausible to say that impersonal events, circumstances, chairs, buckets of water, impersonal things, even abstract objects, moral principles, can generate moral obligations by themselves. Because we're not obligated to impersonal things. We're obligated to persons. All right. So I'll let you guys chat about this fourth one here. We're almost done. We got one left. But I'm making the case here that there needs to be a personal authority at the head of the chain of moral obligation for there to be objective moral obligation. I think my theory has that, Wielenberg's doesn't. So another reason why my theory is a better explanation. I'll let you guys discuss here for a few minutes. Well, I saved the best for last, I think. We're down to number 5. You guys are doing good. It's 8:45. So I would probably say I'm most excited about this last one. This last one, number 5, is probably the one that I've spent the most time on. And there's a sense in which my dissertation's only 4 chapters, and there's a sense in which my entire 4th chapter is just on this last one that we're going to talk about. So I'm super excited about it, and I think it illustrates, maybe more so than any of the others or anything else we've talked about these last 5 weeks, why bringing truths about God being a Trinity is so useful to this area of metaethics. So, number 5. It seems as though for morality to be objectively real, that it needs to be grounded, that there has to be an ultimate ground, a source, a foundation, whatever term you want to use. There has to be an ultimate ground for moral truth. As we've talked about before, it just doesn't seem like moral truth is one of those things that can just exist on its own. It needs itself some sort of an explanation. It needs some grounding. We've talked a lot these last few weeks about how many people, both theists and atheists, have agreed to this. That for morality to be objectively real, it needs to be grounded in something. Of course, theists and Christians have argued that God is the most likely candidate, that God's the best explanation for the grounding of objective morality. Many atheists have agreed to this, and we looked at several of them. I'll just remind you. Nietzsche is probably the biggest name who agrees to this, that God is the best explanation for objective morality. Now, as an atheist, he says there is no God, therefore there's no objective morality. But he agrees with that initial conditional. For that there to be objective morality, there needs to be an ultimate grounding. Another big name in atheist philosophy, Sartre, also would affirm that conditional, that God is necessary as a grounding for moral truth. Now, these atheists, as I said, they don't believe there is a God, so they reject objective morality. But they affirm what I'm trying to say here, that virtually all theists say, that there needs to be a grounding for there to be objective moral truth. Now, let's start off with Wielenberg this time around, because as we've seen, one of the key parts of his theory is that he claims morality doesn't need a grounding, that moral truth can exist on its own without any sort of source and foundation. We've talked a lot about how these brute ethical facts of his, sometimes he describes them as abstract objects, play a very large role in his theory. And I've shown you how a lot of people have criticized this idea of ungrounded moral facts. Both theist and atheist have criticized that idea, so we're not going to go through that again. We've already criticized his theory for that idea. So what I'd like to do instead is focus on this particular strategy of his. Okay? What I want to focus on here with this last one, this fifth one, is a strategy that Wielenberg takes where he argues, look, you theists can't criticize my theory for having ungrounded moral facts. You can't criticize my theory for that because your theory has ungrounded moral facts too. And so he makes the claim, he tries to make the argument that all theistic theories of morality include in some way, shape, or form some ungrounded moral facts. And I teased him this week, I sent him an email and I said, you're the great ungrounded moral fact hunter. Because one of the things he does is he takes a theistic moral theory and tries to point out where there are ungrounded moral facts. Because his strategy, again, is to say, look, if theists can posit ungrounded moral facts that aren't grounded in God, then I can too. And in fact, if some moral facts are ungrounded, then why can't all of them be? And hence it gives his theory much more plausibility, and he can make the case that there is no God, and we don't need a God for objective morality. So the question is, do theistic theories really have ungrounded moral facts? Do they really have facts that are ungrounded? And he, as I said, he attempts to point out where they have these ungrounded moral facts. The theory that he spends the most time with is Robert Adams' theory. As I said, Robert Adams is probably the most well-known, respected theistic moral theory out there today. And so it's a good reason that Wielenberg would focus on Adams' theory. So, for example, he tries to point out some places in Adams' theory where there's ungrounded moral facts. He wrote, Adams' divine, not my Adam, Robert Adams, Robert Adams' divine command theory relies on ethical claims for which no further explanation is provided. Adams provides no explanation for them. Within his system, they are brute ethical facts, just like mine. And he goes on to claim that, any theistic theory is going to ultimately have these ungrounded moral facts, ungrounded moral truths in them. So that's why I spent so much time in developing my theory to try to show that the Trinitarian moral theory, my theory, doesn't have any ungrounded facts. And that's why I'm excited to present this last one, because I think that I'm successful in that. I guess we'll find out on Sunday night. But I worked very hard to show how I don't have any ungrounded facts in my theory. Now, Wielenberg, when he evaluates a theistic moral theory and tries to point out ungrounded moral facts, he usually finds them in the area of moral obligation. Okay? As we've talked about, there's moral value, and then there's moral obligation. So, for example, he points out that in divine command theory, and the divine command theorist's explanation of the origin of our moral duties depends on an ungrounded ethical fact, namely that if the good, God, commands you to do something, then you're morally obligated to do it. Well, the atheist might ask, what's the grounding for this ethical claim? So in other words, why should we obey God's commands? What grounds that? Now, I've looked at a lot of different answers to this question, and Christian philosophers have wrestled with this question all throughout the centuries, and I've read at least a dozen different attempts to try to answer that question. What grounds the moral truth that we should obey God's commands? And I think John Hare at Yale University, I think John Hare provides the best answer to this question. And Hare is drawing on Duns Scotus, a very famous medieval Christian philosopher. So take a look at John Hare's explanation, his answer to this question. Why should we obey God's commands? Hare wrote, it is necessarily true, Scotus, according to Scotus, he's pulling on Scotus's work here. It's necessarily true, Scotus holds, that God is to be loved. We know this just by knowing the terms God and to be loved. It's also true that we know that to love God is at least to obey God. So I'm making the case here, along with John Hare and Duns Scotus, that ultimately the truth, God should be loved, is what generates our obligation to obey Him. But again, Wielenberg might say, well, what grounds this truth? The truth that God should be loved. I think the key here is to see the strong connection between loving God and obeying God. So here's some verses. Jesus makes this connection a lot. Between obeying God and loving God. I won't take the time to read those verses, but you've probably read them already, both in John 14 and then later in the New Testament, in 1 John. So there's a strong connection between loving God and obeying God. So back to my question though, what grounds this truth, that God should be loved? Well, I'm going to make the case that this truth is not ungrounded, but it's grounded in who God is. This truth that God should be loved, therefore obeyed, love and obedience being almost synonyms. At a minimum, obedience is how we express our love to God. But this truth, God should be loved, is not ungrounded because it comes from facts about who and what God is. And so it is grounded in God. We can agree, yeah, there's brute facts about God, that He exists, that He's a Trinity. But these facts aren't ultimate. It's God who is ultimate, and these facts about Him are just descriptions of who and what He's like. So I think by definition they're grounded in Him. At a minimum, I think there's a world of difference between saying, look, there are facts, brute facts about a concrete being, God, and Wielenberg's proposal that there's these ungrounded facts that aren't grounded or have any foundation whatsoever. They just exist abstractly on their own somehow. I think there's a world of difference between us positing these facts about a concrete being versus his abstract facts that supposedly just exist on their own. So the last part of this is another question that comes up in this conversation. And that is, why is loving and obeying God good? So I'm making the case here that the root of obligation is that God should be loved. That answers the question, why should we obey God's commands? Well, because God should be loved. And that's not an ungrounded fact, it's grounded in who and what God is. But then somebody, Wielenberg, or somebody might come along and say, well, why is loving and obeying God good? And I think this is a part of my theory that I'm really excited about, because I think the Trinity is such a huge help to answer this question. Why is obeying God a good thing? And I think what the Trinity does, more than anything else, any other aspect about God, what the Trinity helps us do here in metaethics is connect these two things. I think this is one thing that metaethical theories have a difficult time with. They're trying to explain these two things, but they struggle often with how to explain that these two things are connected. They almost seem like two different animals. But if we want to make a theory of morality, I think it goes a long ways to show how these two things are connected. And that's what I think that my theory can do, is show why obedience is good. So in other words, I'm connecting moral obligation, loving and obeying God, to moral value, trying to show why moral obligation, obeying God, is a morally good thing. So that's a long setup, but here's the argument in a nutshell. As I've been saying, all these weeks, something is morally good if it resembles God. And here's the key premise. Our loving and obeying God resembles God. So our love of God and our obedience to God resembles the Trinity, because there's love and obedience in the Trinity. So because our love and obedience resembles the Trinity, resembles God, therefore, according to premise 1, it is morally good. And here's something that keyed me on to this from John 15, where Jesus himself makes this connection that the love and obedience in the Trinity is a model, if you will, of our love and obedience that we should have with God. So I will read this from John 15. Jesus said, "Just as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love." So there's love and obedience in the Trinity. When we love and obey God, that makes that love and obedience a morally good thing. And I think, again, this is my attempt to ground all of morality in God. And so I'm not left with any ungrounded moral facts. Even moral obligation itself is grounded in God. So that's my argument in a nutshell. That's number 5. So I'll let you guys, again, discuss for a few minutes, and we'll come back. And I don't have anything else for the lecture except just maybe your questions, comments, thoughts, and then we could have a conversation together as a group. So go ahead, I'll let you discuss by yourselves here for a few minutes.